Muy buenas tardes a todos. Nos encontramos hoy en el último día del Congreso y en este panel tenemos una sesión sobre Educational Disruptions in the United States con dos ponentes, Robert Unzueta y Brenda Valles. Comenzaremos primero con las presentaciones y luego con las preguntas. Si se les surge una pregunta durante las presentaciones, pongan su pregunta, por favor, en el chat y luego contestaremos las preguntas a continuación. So, Robert Unzueta will be our first presenter. Dr. Robert Unzueta is an academic program assistant for Portland Public Schools Ethnic Studies for K through 12, and an elected board member for the National Association of Chicana and Chicano Studies. A former assistant professor of teacher education and educational leadership at Lewis and Clark College. Today, he will speak to us on Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx studies implementation in a K-12 setting, a disruption in the color line.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. Hi, my name is Dr. Unzueta, Robert Unzueta. I am coming to you from Portland, Oregon, one of the whitest states in the United States and one of the whitest cities there is. And that's why I think this work is important to share and discuss and how I understand it, especially in a K-12 setting. So let me pause really quick and kind of share with you why and how I see this work as a disruption. So first and foremost, ethnic studies, Chicano studies, Latino studies is built on disruption of traditional educational access to students of color in the US, right? And a lot of that work has started for generations since compulsory school was ever created. And so for me, I really situate my work in this disruption of access to the foundation of ethnic studies in the 1960s, in particular 1968. And how do we think about public education as a tool in the US to replicate caste dynamics? And what I mean by that is how have we used education as a justification for the economic exploitation of students of color and their families generationally. And so the 1968 blowouts in LA, Texas, and including the movements in Mexico were about the demand of change. And so I center that as my foundation of how I enter this work and why I see K-12 as an important place to disrupt, especially when students here in the US spend 6 to 8 hours a day for 12 to 13 years of their lives in these institutions. So I like to situate it in the Plan de Aztlán or Santa Barbara. And I quote, in addition to this, all attempts must be made to take the college and university to the barrio, where it be in form of classes, giving college credit or community centers financed by the school for the use of community organization and groups. Also, the barrio must be brought to the campus, whether it be for special programs or ongoing services, which the school provides for the people of the barrio. So from the very beginning, ethnic studies, Chicano studies, Latino studies has been grounded in creating access for students who traditionally have been excluded deliberately through various barriers. And so within ethnic studies research currently, there's some key pillars that have emerged from the literature, and I'd like to touch on that and how my work departs a little bit. Right now, there's a lot of literature understanding ethnic studies curriculum and student identity, sense of self-esteem. It has been noted that students who engage in work, history, and dialogue centered around their experience have better sense of self and positive relationships with themselves and their communities and their families. Ethnic studies and student achievement It has been noted that ethnic studies in a K-12 setting and in higher ed setting has led to higher performance of students. This is at college and in high school, and a boost of GPAs up to 1.4, higher test scores, and higher attendance records. And particularly for students who are at risk. This has been shown to have positive impact on these students. There's ethnic studies curriculum infused into asset-based pedagogy, so understanding the cultural capital that students bring to the classroom and how that engages them in participation and ownership of their education, and then a cultural responsive teaching and student achievement. So for me, I look at implementing ethnic studies a little bit differently. And so I ground it in a theoretical understanding of coloniality of caste. And so I draw on very two distinct theoretical frameworks and how that applies to the U.S. educational institution. In particular, I draw on coloniality as it makes sense of the array of identities that Chicanx, Latinx communities embody, and how knowledge has been produced since 1492 to normalize that dehumanization. And within that, we've created entire societies based on hierarchy of race, and how an entire class structure was based on who was white and who was non-white, the colonized and the colonizer. And for the US setting, that racial dynamic is a little different. And so I had to draw on caste, which has been very influenced by a Black radical tradition, in particular looking at how economy and labor is shaped through race. So understanding that race and class have co-evolved in the US to create our own structure of race, and understanding where Latinx, Chicanx people fall into that category is a little more nuanced, since a lot of our laws here are Black and white and indigenous, determine how indigenous you are or not. And so I understand that our schools play a pivotal role in prepping the next generation of workers. And to understand the educational inequality in the history of the US, all you have to do is understand the history of labor and where particular groups of people have worked and how that education has reflected that labor relation. And so for me, I see capital being an important factor of how race is utilized to exclude students, in particular Latino Chicano students, from the educational process. So in that, I've looked at the history of schooling for Mexican Americans, Latino Chicano students in the Southwest and in the US in general for the last 100 years. And in particular, we have key economic episodes that schools reflect kind of the position that students occupy in labor and their families occupy in labor. So there's Mexican schools for Americanization, where schools were really geared at educating students at the lowest denominator to go and occupy the fields. This is when there was Mexican schools in the Southwest, pre-Brown v. Board, right? And it was the foundation to desegregation across the country. Then in the 1960s, you had they were integrated into schools, but they were vocational schools or vocational tracks. So tracking was very important. And this is what the 1960s walkouts were about. How do we gain college access for these students and not limit them to vocational work? And then currently, and most recently, which I've looked at, is how schools have served as sites of disposability. So how have we turned schools into extensions of our police state? And how have schools served as a space to not only track students into low-wage labor, but now put them into prisons? And this is the school to prison pipeline. So as the labor that was once occupied by Latino Chicano males in particular has been outsourced or no longer viable economic opportunities, we've created an entire prison system to hold these bodies and still extract labor from them. And so for me, it's important understanding the kind of history of education as it relates to different economic episodes for the Chicano Latino community. And so currently, the questions that I have is, how in this current day and age in white Oregon do we introduce Chicano Latino ethnic studies as a disruption to that history of education that I just mentioned? And so one of the questions that I'm asking is, how would we create a pathway opportunity for Chicano Latino students through ethnic studies? What systemic barriers are we disrupting, engaging, and unraveling? So I see this work as almost water and oil. Right? To have liberatory education is almost counter to education itself and the purposes served for our communities historically. And more importantly, what systemic barriers are we addressing and unraveling when we engage in implementing ethnic studies? And so I look at it from a 5-pronged approach. How do we create sustainable change within this institution that was not built around us or for us? And so in particular, the first step, and I should have put a slideshow together, I'm sorry, is a dialogical relationship. So who is the stakeholders? What is demand? What are the problems that inform what we do? The second approach is from those stakeholders in that listening session and dialogue and building questions, how do we co-construct a guiding framework of what we are addressing? And so in particular with ethnic studies and CRT, they've been conflated here, and there's a lot of controversy around them and a lot of people wanting to do this work. And I think this is going to lead up great to Dr. Valles' presentation, but without any really parameters or framework of what it is. And so from that, how do we build sustainable partnerships across institutions, from community to parents to educators? And from that, how do we build capacity? So across Oregon, Washington, and California, we've introduced ethnic studies bills and incorporating them in standards, but also in curriculum, with no really guiding framework or understanding what does that actually mean. And in particular, another paper that I'm working on in the future is, how do we train educators with no background in ethnic studies to engage in ethnic studies, not only pedagogically, but also in standards? And then lastly, what are the critical reflections that need to occur to implement, assess, adjust, and engage in this cycle? Again, I apologize really quick. I need to get someone a popsicle. Hold on. I'll keep on talking. So from that, what does it mean to do this work in Oregon? And so as I explore the historical legacy and context of ethnic studies in the Southwest in relationship to class and race in the U.S., it's important to analyze what does that mean in Oregon. In Oregon particularly is white utopia. And white utopia started with the Oregon Land Donation Act that allowed white settlers to come in here and pretty much occupy any land they want and take claim to that. On top of that, Oregon also has a strong history of anti-Blackness, including the Black Exclusion Acts of the 1840s. And so when you think about that legacy of how Oregon has been set up as a white utopia, an escape from the diversification that was occurring in the 1850s, how does that legacy continue to impact students here? So Portland Public serves 50,000 students. 16% of those students are Latinx. But we employ a 90% white teacher force. Of those white teachers, and almost 17%, she's coming right now, 17% of Latinx students, we also have a completion rate of only 77% and a 6% push-out rate with a 12% incarceration rate in the state. Now the push-out rate is alarming because they only make up a small percentage of the population, and their push-out rate is double the national average at 3%. So when I think about engaging in ethnic studies, in particular in the history of ethnic studies, the power of ethnic studies, the demands of ethnic studies, and what does it look like to engage in disruption, what has been important to me is identifying systemic institutional barriers that we need to engage in beyond how good students feel, but what are the economic impacts of the work that we have for our students, 10, 20, 50 years from now. And so for me, the most important thing and easiest place to disrupt was addressing the legacy of tracking, testing through AP, IB, gifted and talented programs. So how have our students been excluded from college access and access to higher wages starting in K-12? And what are the systems in which we can disrupt to start opening those pathways? And so the first thing we did was understand what the students wanted across the state. And that's K-12 and college. And then how do we construct a seamless pathway for students? And so what we're doing is creating a dual credit class offered to every high school student that's an elective that has dual credit at the Portland Community College. So they'll take 4 elective credits here in the district that anyone can take, and they'll get 4 academic credits that's recognized statewide, but also nationally. How do we build sustainable partnerships? Back to the disruption. So we created an articulation agreement between us and Portland Public, our Portland Community College. They've also created a partnership with Pacific University, where they'll be recruiting and training diverse students of color to become teachers. The biggest part of this work that I've been working on lately is building capacity. So how do we expand teachers' ability to engage in this work? And so we've been working really nonstop to co-construct with a small group of teachers ethnic studies curriculum and pedagogical practices, in which I'm really excited that we just got a grant that the students will be publishing and creating their own textbook based on the kind of local histories and fight for ethnic studies. And so from there is really thinking about what is the longitudinal impact of Chicano Latino studies implementations in Portland and in Oregon. And what I'm hoping is in the future, as we continue to move forward with this lift, is understanding what are the new assessment metrics of capturing the impact of this work for students, and what economic disruptions are we actually engaging in the next 5 to 10 years. And so with that, I want to be cognizant of time and pass it over.
Thank you very much, Robert. And if you have questions for Robert, please put them in the chat. And when we finish with our next presentation, we will take questions for both of our presenters. Which brings us to our second presenter, who is Dr. Brenda Valles, who is an assistant professor in the Student Affairs Administration Master's Program at Lewis and Clark Graduate School for Education and Counseling. In addition to teaching in the program, she serves as program director. She also teaches in the Educational Leadership Program for the Higher Education Doctoral Concentration. Dr. Valles brings experience as a practitioner in administrative roles in higher education that focused on assessment, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this afternoon, she speaks to us on Chief Diversity Officers navigating liminality within higher education institutions. Dr. Valles.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Unzueta, for that context, because I think a lot of what I want to talk about draws on that theme of historical economic exploitation. Specifically, I'm looking at Latinx Chief Diversity Officers. And so I want to place them within a context for you. So I want to share some of the demographics that this role sits in and then describe what the role is to get to what guides my research. So the majority of US college leadership is made up of predominantly white executive leaders. The chief diversity role is one of the most diverse roles within the sometimes executive role. It's not always on the executive role. And according to data from the executive management industry as of 2020, 7% of chief diversity officers are of Latinx background or heritage, placing them sort of in liminality within their racial, ethnic, and embodied identities, and within the larger institution, meaning they're not quite where they are among colleagues and peers that share their heritage and background. And in contrast, 20% of college students identify as Latinx as of 2019 enrollment data from the National Center of Education Statistics. And as of the same year, 2019-2020, the US federal government designated 30 colleges as Hispanic serving institutions, bringing the total up to 570, meaning the landscape of higher ed across the country is continuously Latinx emergent. So these roles are existing within an increasingly Latinx diverse role and a highly sought out status, which is the HSI status for the institutions. So with a predicted increase of HSIs, which has been expected, the Latinx college going population in 2019 across 18 states in the US, I bring this note because it stood out to me when I read it. In 18 states across the US, Latinx kindergartners made up 20%. So that trend is going to continue in the US. And I contrast that with the Chief Diversity Officer role, which is meant to create institutions that are ready for equity, inclusion, diversity, or a variety of other similar terms and goals. While very few of them are filled by Latinx individuals, there's a gap there. So in moving to describe the role a little bit more, as I mentioned, they are increasingly popular. They are increasingly growing across the country in US colleges and universities, and even in the private sector. And this interest was boosted after the George Floyd murder here in the US. They are housed all across the institution. Some of them have direct access to the president and reporting to the president. Others report to a vice president. Others live in HR in terms of their role. So some have executive titles, others do not. Placing them, again, within this liminal space of not having clarity of what the role is among their administrative leadership peers. A significant characteristic, a defining characteristic of these roles, which is they're often called a CDO role, but their titles kind of vary a little bit, is the budget and staff size. So that's usually sort of an indicator of what kind of potential change the role can make. So that brought me to my guiding question with that context of where they exist as Latinx individuals within higher ed, where higher ed is headed, and how variable that role is. It led to my guiding question of Latina, Latino, Latinx chief diversity officers often embody bilingual, bicultural, transnational identities that situate them in increasingly liminal spaces and positionalities within the US. What are the unique contributions and characteristics that Latinx chief diversity officers bring to US education institutions? Particularly when we draw on their educación and inherited ancestral wisdom. So I'm looking to the literature here and finding there are 3 key themes that have sort of presented themselves in terms of what makes Latinx chief diversity officers unique. I argue also incredibly necessary with the direction of higher education, but in this piece here, I'm not looking at the need for the roles, and I'm not looking at the way the roles can be oftentimes symbolic and exploitative of the individuals in that role. I'm looking specifically at what are those unique characteristics that Latinx CDOs, chief diversity officers, bring. And the first, I think about that theme of transcending boundaries in leadership. With that very liminal space that they occupy, I draw from Chicana feminist scholars like Anzaldúa predominantly, and think about the potential benefits of utilizing that liminal space as a source of strength. As she named it, the third space, or that borderland space. And I think about this when thinking about the linguistic, creative contributions that can come from that, the paradigmatic, unique contributions that can come from that, and the political awareness and beyond. But I think about those characteristics in terms of being able to transcend boundaries in leadership and offer unique solutions and changes within the organization of higher ed that would be very, very informed by that unique experience. Secondly, the second theme is the collectivist and the collectivist leadership approach. Scholars like Laura Rendón, Ángela Valenzuela, Antonia Darder, Dolores Delgado Bernal, and others describe the unique care and efforts that Latinx leaders and scholars and students bring toward community building. There is an inherent knowledge that Latinx CDOs would bring then from drawing on this cultural norm to that would be rooted in this wisdom to create collective space, to root their administrative leadership work within building community and bridges, which would again be a very unique and very different executive leadership characteristic. The third is right now my favorite, and it's the resilience and humor in leadership. So being able to draw on their identity, their heritage, the knowledge, the educación from home, so to speak, to be able to bring that into their leadership. And so I draw on scholars like Tarayoso, Luis Urieta Jr., and others to understand the way our families and communities across transnational generations pass on resilience and lean on humor as a manifestation of that resilience, as a source of strength, and often as a source of sustenance to navigate some of the complex terrain that we do, drawing back to Dr. Unzueta's presentation. So my conclusion is that the embodied positionality of Latinx CDOs position them in constant liminality and negotiation of their identities, of how these identities also position them in vulnerable positions as well. And yet, I believe the leadership is comprised of practices that can draw on the educación de casa and be able to bring that into spaces that have not traditionally created space for those practices, to begin to change some of what is normative and viewed as normative in higher ed, which can result in CDOs being very critical to the transformation of higher education today and in the near future, because it won't take those kindergartners very long before they're knocking on college doors and needing to fill those spaces. And there's one right there in progress. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. You, I think, have given us some pretty thought-provoking ideas, both of you. At this point, we would entertain questions. Que si quieren ofrecer preguntas, pueden ponerlas en el chat o en inglés o en español. At the moment, we don't have one, but Robert, who, guys, I don't know how you do it. What were you calling Oregon? The white what?
White utopia.
White utopia. It's only utopian for the whites, I think.
Well, the more we show up, the less it becomes utopia for them, and they start moving to Idaho.
Okay. I had a couple of questions for you, because we're laughing saying white utopia, but it is clearly a, I guess in my era, we would have called it a Wonder Bread zone, very, very white. In order to start removing barriers that the utopian group does not even consider as barriers, they consider it as birthright. How do you start breaking these down? And I heard you use the word disruption, and I know disruption is a huge academic term. It's definitely used in left-leaning newspapers, and I understand it, but how, what are the steps? What do you do?
I think here, like any other place, in particular in public schools and K-12, if you can ground it in college and career readiness with a closing the achievement gap, opportunity gap, whatever language that the school districts are judged on and evaluated on for federal funding, state funding, and local funding, aligning your work and language with what is it they're trying to accomplish has been the most successful route. And so here, because it's a left-leaning place, we could say ethnic studies. With the group that I'm working in Utah, we can't call it ethnic studies. So we're thinking about new words and new ways to still capture this disruption in a way that is not going to draw some of that attention.
Why can't you say ethnic studies?
Oh, in Utah, they're banning race studies, critical race
studies.
CRT.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have to find creative ways to still engage in that work, as we always have.
Your questions, your answer segues exactly into a question that we have, and it also dovetails with Dr. Valles. Esther asks, can either of you talk about some of the changes in the curricula in terms of ethnic studies in K-12?
Yeah, I could speak about that. It hasn't happened. I hate to be at least here, and there's pockets of work that's happening, and there's some good people doing good work, but the issue is that there is no teacher education program in the country that is preparing teachers to engage in this work. At most is you have folks with minimal backgrounds, maybe 1 class, 2 class in this work, but teacher ed is not built around disruption. It's built around the tests and best practices. So the issue, what we're trying to do, and I think the easiest route has been aligning our work with the college, since that's where the ethnic studies is kind of started and heavily researched and focused on. And if we aligning our work and removing that silo, oh my God, it has helped usher in those standards and what it can be. But as of right now, there is no really guiding framework of what it could be or what it is. And so it's kind of a free-for-all across districts and across states.
Dr. Valles, would you like to respond as well?
Sure. I think in addition to what Dr. Unsueta's pointing to, there is this this context, and it's a part of the work that I've done, but I'm not exploring that right at this in this particular paper. But it's this notion of what becomes symbolic in these conversations, and what becomes sort of there are often policies, and there are often sometimes even state legislation promoting these changes that are going to be coming at the K-12 level, or that are going to be arriving, but without the capacity, to Dr. Unsueta's point, and without actual trained individuals, these remain largely symbolic. So even the conversations that we're having across the country around the need to examine things like race in the curriculum, you're still faced with the issue that the educators and educational leaders are ill-equipped to lead those conversations, as are the educational teacher training programs and higher ed programs broadly. And so it becomes kind of a trap, or at least a placating symbolic gesture. So in terms of changes, I think we're at that phase.
I'd like to tag on to that, where you're talking about a symbolic gesture and placating, going back to your talk about chief diversity officer, or whatever it's called in one's own institution. And you were talking about the word role, which is a hugely popular term for job. And we say role, nobody has a job, we have a role. But laughing aside, what you said is absolutely true. Is putting in a person of color, I mean, you can't put me as chief diversity officer. It won't fly. But is putting someone of color in as chief diversity officer a true step forward? Or is it an attempt to satisfy a certain audience? And I would, since you're all over the numbers, I would like to ask you about the money, because everyone says follow the money. Where's the money? And if you put the person in the role and you, I would say, entre parentheses, purposefully underfund them, you guarantee a certain type of result. So could you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. That's why one of the largest indicators is the budget and the amount of staff that this person leads, in addition to the hierarchical position that they're placed in the larger the institutional map. But really, when you follow the numbers, you find that most don't have a budget, and most are the first. Right now, most CDOs are the first at the institution's history. And the contradiction lies in that the job that they take, the role they have, is an insurmountable one. Change the institution, change our institutional culture. I can't even begin to talk about how you measure some of the expectations placed on these roles. And it's why research is indicating they have between 1 to 3 years shelf life of survival in the role. And often they're very contentious roles. They're very high burnout roles. And the people in these roles often take them for altruistic reasons. However, they often face a brunt of abuse and violence in those roles, things even to the point of death threats. And having been in that role previously in my previous work, I can personally, attest to how they can be quite tumultuous roles to take. And so you are told when you take the role by the professional organization of chief diversity officers that you need an exit plan immediately entering the role. So the climate for this work is such that it's almost impossible. But I'm still arguing that Latinx CDOs are overlooked, that we're still, I mean, to borrow a phrase that Dr. Unzueta utilized, we're still looking at a black and white paradigm in higher education. And we do not see anything in between, even when the demographics are like knocking down the building. So we are in a really liminal space. We're in a really unknown space around that.
Thank you. Depressing, but I think accurate, and something that we should all consider carefully as we get ready to start a new academic year, and something that I think we're called to bear witness to. We, as members of academic communities, need to support our CDOs. I'm glad that there are exit plans. I'm pressed to hear it, but I think it's wise. I was not aware of death threats. I think we don't have any more questions, but I would like to throw out to both of you, since I had to ask Robert, what was the problem with Utah? The list is long. CRT. We're going into a new year. I think faculty in K-12 and in post-secondary are living in this liminal space of, what do we do about CRT? Do we turn a blind eye and pretend that race is not a variable in our lives? Do we speak to it? How do we speak to it, and at what cost? I'd really like to hear what the two of you would say.
I'm gonna lean on Dr. Bias, as she is a CRT scholar.
Oh, you passed that hot potato.
Yeah. We'll throw it back. I think that with the CRT conversation, I think it's become so politicized in terms of what it even means, and yet so few people actually understand what it is, that it's a very muddy conversation, and it's almost, to engage in it actively can be very much like a quicksand situation, because I think a better approach is to find ways to incorporate some of the tenets that CRT brings. And I'm of the mind of doing the work, and maybe if you don't have to call it CRT because it's going to draw attention, then call it what you need to call it, but you could still do the work. And so, you know, historicizing race and race contexts to understand contemporary policies and laws, such as voting rights. I mean, that would be an example of how you can continue to utilize the tenets, understand that communities of color all have knowledge and wisdom that is valid, that is real, can be incorporated. So there are many tenets that are useful, working toward social justice, working toward changing our world to be more inclusive and to be more, to serve more communities. That's a different way in which we would continue to draw on the tenets without calling it critical race theory. And so I'm not saying turn a blind eye, but being really intentional in the purpose to engage and understand what the outcome that you're seeking is. If it is a rhetorical conversation, you want to play rhetorical tennis with someone, go ahead, enjoy yourself. But you know, if you're wanting to actually do the work and incorporate it in your classrooms or incorporate it in your practice, then I would say there's nothing to disrupt that. You can simply just not call it that.
We have a comment from Esther, who asked the previous question, and she says, quote, bearing witness, yes. I recommend Witnessing Beyond Recognition by Kelly Oliver, challenging the fundamental tenet of the multicultural movement that social struggles turning upon race, gender, and sexuality are struggles for recognition. This work offers a powerful critique of current conceptions of identity and subjectivity based on Hegelian notions of recognition. Instead, she coins the term bearing witness, which implies an ethical responsibility to the other, especially to minorities. I think she captured it. I would, even to minorities, I would say to the marginalized. So anybody not riding in the fast lane. Esther, thank you. That, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments? I think not. Robert and Brenda, thank you so much for two stimulating presentations, and hopefully two presentations that will stir us and arm us and maybe cloak us in the armor of doing what needs doing as we march into another academic year. Turning a blind eye is not bearing witness. So thank you both so much. And I look forward to future contacts with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope to see you at the clausura.
Thank you.
Thank you.